Well, time now for your business news. E-tolling. Gauteng's highways has failed and the system falls short of its intentions. So says the opposition to urban tolling. This week during the Gauteng Advisory Panel hearings on the socio-economic impact of e-tolls on Monday. Now, according to OUTA, the system is falling short, or far short rather, of its intentions and targets. Now, hopes that the government might still adjust the e-tolling system in Gauteng to ease the burden for motorists were revived when Gauteng Premier David Makhura announced an advisory panel to assess the socio-economic effects of the system a few weeks ago. 50-member panel's terms of reference are to assess the effects of e-tolling since the system went into operation in December. The panel has already started with its month-long consultation on Wednesday in Midrand. Now, for more on this story, in studio we are joined by OUTA's spokesperson, Clarke. John, good morning to you and welcome to AM.
Good, nice to be here.
Now, it's been a couple of days that the panel is in session. Your impressions thus far?
Well, there's a sense in which we could take a certain conceited pride over it because, you know, when OUTA was formed, we predicted all the sorts of scenarios which we now have. But we won't do that because, and we're trying not to do it because we're wanting to try and get beyond the adversarial kind of, you know, sort of finger pointing and naming and blaming, to actually say, well, if we spent all this money, let's harvest the deeper lessons. Let's take SANRAL at its word. It claims to be a learning organization. Well, what is learning? You embrace your errors. And the errors which can be learned, not just about e-tolling and SANRAL per se, but the socio-economic and political context within which you try and bring in innovation. You know, I use the example, the Wright brothers showed that it was technically and scientifically possible for a manned space aeroplane to fly heavier than air.
Yes.
It took, I think, 30 years before flying became a commercial and social innovation. So you could prove it scientifically, but it's the people that must make it happen. It's the socio-economic reality that makes the thing happen or gives it a success story.
But let's talk about this advisory panel. What is the overview mandate of this panel?
Well, it's really to examine the socio-economic impact of e-tolling. Now, SANRAL is a national agency, and the whole issue and the policy was formed at the national level. And of course, the Gauteng province doesn't have the power politically to scrap it. But, well, you know, it's not really the issue. The issue is the economy has to sustain it. And it's the people of Gauteng that do it. So, you know, the National Parliament might want to, and I use the analogy, decide they want to repeal the law of gravity. And no matter how many MPs or parties support the decision to repeal the law of gravity, gravity is going to assert itself. And in that sense, the economy will determine the success or failure of e-tolling ultimately. So is it going to work?
So are you suggesting that economically e-tolls doesn't make sense?
It doesn't make sense whatsoever in this particular context. And what also doesn't make sense is to think that you can simply pass a law to say, well, it's a criminal offence if you don't pay your e-tolls and therefore we'll force it. That is a kind of the command economy type logic that is discredited from the 20th century. That command economy type logic does not work because economics is essentially about people creating and doing things and making something generative. And for me, one of the useful lessons we've learned in OUTA is that there is an enormous amount of ingenuity, entrepreneurialism and creativity. But it's all been on the side of OUTA fighting SANRAL. Now, that's not what you want to do. You want to see this thing work for the economy, for everybody. So in that sense, we're wanting to say to SANRAL, come guys, let's sit down, let's be honest, let's kind of forgive each other, let's start a new conversation. How can we make South Johannesburg and Gauteng's urban transport infrastructure work in an integrated way that serves people?
Now, you made your presentation this week. Do you think that this time you'll make a breakthrough?
Well, the people have said, why wasn't SANRAL there and why aren't SANRAL making a presentation? So the breakthrough will come in terms of what I'm envisaging only when we get to that round table process and look with them in the eye. Because in fact, a lot of a substantial part of our presentation was to challenge SANRAL on ethical issues. Now, it's not the right place to sit in a boardroom or in a, you know, to kind of challenge somebody about ethical issues if they're not there. I say you should actually more be in the confessional, in a kind of facilitated process, because let's make no mistake about it. There have been some serious issues of dishonesty and wrongdoing and maladministration. But of course, again, it's not up to the Gauteng Review Panel to deal with those. That's for other courts, other contexts, adversarial contexts, which is why we also lodged a complaint to the Public Protector about issues of deceit and dishonesty. And we need to get those out the way. We need to acknowledge that there was deceit and manipulation and an attempt to try and kind of like browbeat and manipulate people into supporting this e-toll thing, which in fact is what led to its demise.
What did your presentation entail?
It entailed basically giving the panel the hard nuts and bolts statistical and analytical information that they needed. A lot of people have made presentations which are argued more around a moral or ethical or kind of even religious sort of perspective, all of which we say that's a very, very important, because unless you've got a right moral or kind of ethical justification from the outset, well, it doesn't matter if it's going to be strategic or operationally inefficient. I mean, if you think back, I worked for the IEC in 1994. We had massive logistical problems. We made that election work because we were determined as a nation. We're going to make this thing work. So in that sense, we've kind of got the things wrong way around. So I want to say 20 years into democracy, this whole e-tolling thing has actually been quite a good opportunity for us to say, well, what is a democracy? And the key issue, if you want to sum up what OUTA's concern is, SANRAL's total lack of transparency and engagement and openness. Not just about the Gauteng Freeway of Improvement project. It goes to what's happening in the Western Cape, the whole Winan scheme. I have for 10 years been working in trying to beg SANRAL to be more transparent on the N2 Wild Coast Toll Road in the Eastern Cape. There's an issue in Durban about the toll. So it's about a kind of an institution that has become sort of very secretive and very kind of closed and very spare and very kind of mingy with the information it gives. That's not what a democratic society is about. So get that right, and let's get a new regime in place that actually says we want to be an inclusive institution and make our urban systems work properly.
So you're saying they're economic with the information. Now, e-tolling is the competency of the central government, and the change of legislation can only be made by cabinet, right? So how are the panel's recommendations going to make any impact on this issue?
Well, we wanted to, there's a concept which I learned in my social work training between something which has political authority as distinct from cognitive authority. Now, you often, like my wife was an occupational nurse. She would know what's happening in an organization because everybody come and share their problems with her. She had huge cognitive authority. She wasn't a decision maker. So I use it as an analogy to say, well, in a sense, what we've tried to do is give the Makhura's panel, this panel, the cognitive, analytical logic, the facts, the figures, as well as some interpretive kind of shaping from our experience. Because one question which they asked, they said, what is OUTA? Well, who is OUTA? And it was an interesting question because OUTA's, in a sense, had three different incarnations. Before OUTA, it was a group of business associations, Savrala, the retail motor industries, all trying to engage SANRAL about the, how the system could work, finding that they just put out the shutters and wouldn't negotiate, then deciding to form a body that could have what they call locus standi, to go to court to fight an adversarial battle. That ended in stalemate. But since then, for the last year, what has OUTA been? It's been a kind of a channel of communication for society to express its discontent and its frustration. And in that sense, we've hopefully that's now given them given the government and political leaders, generally, the recognition of how social media is so powerful. Because, OUTA has been really essentially a social media phenomenon. It's been enabled us to channel information, interpret it a little bit, make some sense of it, and put it down as hard statistical data. And that then is, I think, and of course, a politician that's faced with that sort of logic, well, of course, there's only one decision to make, scrap it. And if they don't do it, well, then there's the other question. There has to be another agenda. And then what the politicians do is delegitimize themselves, make themselves look foolish. We're not wanting to make any politician from any party look like fools. We want our society to function in a proper way whereby you have intelligent debate. And I think it's just a matter of time where the Minister of Transport would say, okay, well, maybe we didn't make the right decision. But OUTA, if you agree not to kind of thump us over the head and make us look foolish, maybe we'll change our decision and let's kind of, and kiss and make up. If
Now-
you know what I mean.
now
See,
the-
I'm afraid I'm a
Yes.
social worker. All that sort of metaphor comes to mind.
Now, GFIB, the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project, I believe, for one, that Gauteng motorists want to pay for the system, but they don't want to pay e-tolls. What are the alternatives?
Well,
then?
yes, and we found that in a large part of our presentation, and we've got given some good crunching analysis of alternatives to e-tolling that were less costly, or in fact didn't carry the cost. And we're also then equitable, because of course people have said the fuel levy fund is not fair, because why should the whole of South Africa pay for Gauteng roads investment? Well, we've shown that in fact Gauteng is a major sort of economic powerhouse of the country, and that most of our taxes actually already are going to help the rest of the country. So, you know, and that's a little bit of a kind of a, we've basically exposed the fallacies in that logic to say that the user, that a actual fuel levy is a user pay system, and a very efficient one. If, and the only reason we say they're very important, but if you're going to make a sort of some sacrifice on efficiency, it's got to be for the sake of greater effectiveness. And if you're going to use tolling, that revenue mustn't go to build roads, it must go to public transport, it must go to integrating transport systems, not just another way of revenue stream to kind of encourage the road industry.
John, we need a much longer time to discuss this issue, but thank you so much for coming in to AM Live.
Thank you.
Now, that